thank you so much, Mr. for inviting me to your lovely country to present. I'm slightly sad there's no snow, but I'm now at the stage where I'm hoping there's no snow so I can actually get home. So it's an interesting balance. Great speech. I just thought I'd add to that fact that Goldman's actually rejected me, so it's not, we all have these histories. Right, where's my bleeper? It's here. So I'm going to give you a bit of an update about where the POI is up to. We've got some interesting figures and statistics now from our first reporting framework, so I will share them with you. It's probably not going to be as interesting as the last speech, but a bit more factual maybe. I'm a figures girl. Right. So I don't know how many people actually know the real history behind the POI, so let me just start with that. Back in 2005, the then UN Secretary General invited a group of large institutional investors, BT Pension Scheme was one of them, to join him in developing an initiative to encourage responsible investing. 10 years later, or just less than 10 years later, the POI signatories represent getting on to 50% of the world's investments. So quite an incredible journey over the last 10 years. A few numbers up here. So we have 2 UN partners, the Global Compact and UNEP-FI. They both sit on our board. We spend a lot of time with them. We do a lot of joint events. In fact, next week in Lima, there's a joint event between the 3 parties. The current number on signatories, and I just had to update this because it's going up so quickly, 1,325, but as I say that, it's out of date. So we're still getting new signatories, which is wonderful. 45 trillion, so I think there's about half of the global number of 100 trillion. I was at a conference in Geneva recently, and someone highlighted that, isn't it incredible we actually don't know how much money is out there? We don't know the value of all the investments. You would think someone would have thought of counting it at some stage. And 6 principles, which are here. I apologise, my slides were a bit, some are scrolling, some are random, so I've kind of mixed them together, so apologies if the animation doesn't quite work. So 6 principles. Very quickly, incorporate ESG, active ownership, seek appropriate disclosure, promote acceptance and implementation, working together and reporting. And I guess it's the 6th principle that I will be talking about today because of the reporting and assessment framework we've just completed. So this is where I get to the charts and the numbers. I hope it's not too dull. So I've said the first part of the presentation, I'll focus on the findings from the 2014 reporting cycle. There's a number of you who would have been through the pain, and I apologise in advance for those who had to complete it. But remember that I had to go through that pain and do it as well when I was at BT Pension Scheme. So probably within the staff of POI, I'm the one who knows and has been through it most of all. And actually, I really enjoyed it because it's a great process. It's an audit process of contacting all your managers and annoying them and saying, how many votes have you done? And what have you done? And what data do you look at? And you can ask them a few sneaky extra questions without them noticing as well. And I always found it was quite a good process to go through. So let's look at the numbers. So the first question I always think is, hang on, 814, I've just said there's over 1,300 signatories. Why are those numbers so different? 2 reasons. At the moment, we only ask the asset managers and the investment managers, the asset owners and the investment managers to report. Service providers at the moment somehow escape, and we'll work out how to catch them. Additionally, when you join the POI, you have 18 months, depending on the cycle, of time to get your responsible investment practices in order, and so you don't have to report. So that's why there's a difference in the numbers. But actually, all those that had to report did report. Now, we were slightly concerned. It's quite a big framework. It's very transparent. It's mandatory. We thought a number of people who had been complaining about the process would not complete the framework. Absolutely did. So the timing for the market on people to report and to be transparent about their actions is very much here and has very much been accepted by the industry. And we're very excited by that. You can see the global spread of the signatory base. So you can see the domination of Europe, America, Australia, which is very much where the founding members of the POI are. as David said, yes, the impact that responsible investment has had in the States has been minimal at best. We still have a lot of the pension schemes and corporate pension schemes who tell us it's against our regulation to do this. And partly because of that, over the next 12 months, we will do some work on fiduciary duty, especially with ERISA. We do now have our first US corporate pension scheme who's got round ERISA in joining, so the Unilever pension scheme. So we feel there's a very much excitement, there's the opportunity there. Also, Asia is a bit of a gap at the moment. Every time I go anywhere near anyone who's got a UN label with them, they point out that you can't be global without Asia. And I absolutely agree, and we're very aware of that. Right, so what did we find? Let's have a look at some of the numbers. And I'll just do a bit of a plug. So there is this wonderful book. It is a bit of a tome, but it's a great reference piece. Report on Progress. It's on the internet. If you want some hard copies, give us a shout. We can send some to you. So how widespread is responsible investment activity? Remember, this is within our signatories. This isn't a look at everybody. So this is approximately 50% of probably the most active players. So this slide goes through asset class by asset class, what signatories reported. And we differentiate between those who manage in-house and those who delegate to asset managers. And that whole conversation we just had about incentive structures, we'll come to that a bit more, but it's kind of that interaction between those parties with the asset owners, really the clear representatives of the beneficiaries, is one that the POI spends a lot of time focusing on. So the top line, just to explain to you what's going on in this kind of slightly weird chart. So top line, which is A, is 437 responses by signatories on listed equity incorporation. So this is basically suggesting that over 80% of signatories say they are doing something on incorporation, and I'll define that term and the different types of incorporation we look at later. The yellow bar there, which is 5-6%, is signatories who say they're doing something but not comfortable enough to report. And we do have a little bit of flexibility on that. And then the blue is signatories who say we're not doing anything. So only 5% of signatories are saying in listed equities, we're doing absolutely nothing. Now, the question, of course, if you're a member of the POI, the chances are you are doing something. So to a certain extent, who knows which leads which. But as you go further down the chart there, so line B, which is listed equity engagement, again, I think a great number. Over 60-70% of people are doing something on engagement. Now, of course, the one thing that POI framework doesn't bring out is, and I can see a few people shaking their heads saying, absolutely, we don't know how much engagement. They might have phoned one company. They might have engaged with everybody in their portfolio. At this stage, with our framework, we don't know this. And this is obviously extra work that we need to do. We already have 228 indicators in our framework. I think if we had any more, we'd kind of get shot. So we need to work out different ways to get some more granularity and more quality reporting out of some of these indicators. But you can see the story goes down, the equities, and then we, at E, F, G, and H, we move into bonds. So I think bonds is a really interesting asset class. At BT Pension Scheme, when I started, we had 60% in public equities. By the time I left, we had 30%, and we had 40-50% in corporate bonds. And I used to ask the question most days, so we're doing all this RI, all this stewardship in public equities, but actually we're doing nothing on our bonds. What can we do? Such a dominant force in our portfolio. So I was one of the ones that encouraged the POI. I don't think they'd call it encouragement. I probably beat them up quite badly. I was the one who was encouraging the POI to really look at bonds, and we now have 3 very good guidance documents on the beginnings of a journey of how you integrate ESG into fixed income. The fixed income module on the reporting assessment is voluntary at the moment, which is why the numbers are quite low. But again, you can see people are beginning to do things. And the bottom 2 numbers there, G and H, are government bonds. So people are thinking about RI even within their government bond portfolios, which is very encouraging. Now, the next slide is non-listed assets. So there is obviously a difference between something that's listed where you have very clear ownership structure, you have the legal framework of an asset class, and then in comparison to a non-listed asset, so private equity, property infrastructure, Sometimes the structure actually is better because you have a smaller number of clients in a portfolio, you have a more long-term structure. So in many cases, the asset classes are structured better, so you can do responsible investing better. And I think because of that, you can see the private equity, which is the top line there. The reporting numbers are great. Over 60% of investors within private equity are doing things. And I think that's a really good representation. I think we have a great working group on private equity, and people are really thinking about this in the way they make decisions and the way they're managing their portfolios. So we're very encouraged with that. Property, again, is a very interesting asset class, and in many countries has real regulation about energy efficiency, measuring carbon emissions, measuring waste that comes out of property. And this is obviously motivating people to think about this asset class. Sitting at the bottom is infrastructure, which is not only incredibly difficult to define. It can be fixed income, it can be a private equity fund, it can be direct, it can be PFI. So it encompasses such an enormous number of assets, and we're still really trying to get our head around to properly define it. So that was the number specifically on how people reported their activities within asset classes to us. Now, for me, some of the numbers in this chart are the ones that kind of concern me the most, yet give us the opportunity for what to do next. So if you think about how an asset manager and an investment manager, an asset owner and investment manager interact, the beneficiaries mandate the asset owner either directly or kind of indirectly to invest the money, usually for the long term or indefinitely. The asset owner then has to give a mandate to the investment manager to invest the funds. Now, what's in that mandate? There's a legal contract. How does the asset owner choose the investment manager? And then how do they monitor it? There's 3 very clear parts of that process. And at the BT Pension Scheme, we spend a lot of time thinking about these 3 different processes. So it's been very interesting to see how that's followed through into the reporting framework. So a couple of numbers to pick up on this. The top line, which talks about the selection process. So do asset owners discuss the manager's governance and management on RI activities? Great outcome, 78%. So a good majority of asset owners, when they're talking to the investment managers, talk about this. 26% of a specific weighting to ESG factors in manager evaluation. Now, I know a lot of the local authority funds are mandatory to do that, but unfortunately, it's not as common practice as it could be. So that's an area for improvement. And then as you get through into the mandate area, so general activities in accordance with your organisation's investment beliefs or RI policy. So as an asset owner, do people reference their RI policy or their investment beliefs in a mandate? We used to do it. We used to staple on the back of our mandates, please read our investment beliefs when you're making investments, but not really anything too firm. So 48%, that's almost half. I think that's quite good. The next 2 numbers really concern me. So requirements relating to voting, 24%. So that means in 3/4 of mandates, there is no comment about how a manager should vote on behalf of the asset owner. So that's a 2-way discussion. Each side hasn't asked or been told. And in an area where stewardship and voting is so important, so how are these decisions being made? Who's guiding them? And then even more concerning, 11% include any sort of legal definition or direction on engagement. 11%. That means there's 89%. See, I'm a good mathematician. Don't ask their managers how they want them to engage. Looking further towards, again, on the monitoring, relatively good numbers that people in their meetings with their managers do ask about RI as a standard. So that at least is good. Although we used to have situations that, going back to BT Pension Scheme, where the manager selection team would, at the end of a meeting, kind of walk out and say, well, they didn't bring up RI. It's obviously not integral into their investment process. And the manager's sitting there going, I'm not going to bring it up. They might think I'm some weird SRI fund who isn't maximising returns. So you have this really interesting kind of this conflict no one wants to bring up, the elephant in the room. So we should definitely all be encouraged, go into your meetings. The first question is, what do you do on RI? How are you thinking about climate change? You might find it revolutionises some of these meetings. I better go quicker. So specifically on some of these gaps, we've looked at long-term mandates. So we have a discussion paper that's up on the internet now, which talks about some of these questions. How do you have a better contract between an asset owner and an investment manager? How do you talk about engagement? How do you talk about long-termism? Do you give them a specific target on turnover? Is that enough? Is that actually completely the wrong thing to mandate someone on? So do go and have a look and read the documents, and we will be producing a firm guidance paper in the new year with lots of case studies about how various managers and various asset owners, such as New Zealand Super, look at long-termism. So thinking a bit more about that word, integration and consideration of RI into investment practices. What do we mean by integration? Well, there's three main common terms of integration. There's screening, which is typically something like cluster bombs or tobacco. Thematic, where you're specifically looking at something like renewable energy as an investment proposition. Or integration, which, as you can see from here, is the most common. So that's considering the ESG factors in your decisions. And actually, I did a Nordic cut for the audience because I thought you might find it interesting. So the far left-hand side, I had to put all the Nordics together just so you kind of couldn't see too much specifics. Now, it's a really interesting chart, I'm sure you'll agree, to see that the kind of some of the countries are nominally ahead of the Nordics, whereas we all think the Nordics are leading. I suspect a lot of this is about the reporting is probably taken more seriously here. It is defined at a higher level. And it also bears that question about we need to go back and do some work on the definitions and quantities. I might flick away from that before you start looking too closely at it. The other thing that's interesting that I will mention is you can see the effect of legislation. So in Netherlands, 94% screening. They have very firm legislation on screening on cluster bombs. The France is more about stewardship, is where people tend to think about. France, you have the Grenelle laws, which talk very much about disclosing how you integrate ESG. So I think you can really begin to see the impact of regulation. Bit more detailed, the methods of integration, so economic analysis, industry analysis, company strategy. Do you use it for idea generation, portfolio construction, fundamental analysis? And you can begin to see the drivers and the different areas. And actually, these subjects are from our paper called Integrated Analysis, which is a great one when you're asking an investment manager what kind of ways are they integrating ESG. So specifically on my area on policy, we asked a question about what are signatories doing in public policy. So from here, 75% of people responded to what is a voluntary question. And 42% of signatories said that, yes, they are active in policy, which personally I think is great. But the most common action is endorsing someone else's written submission. And some work we've done recently highlights that actually face-to-face meetings, as you can kind of guess, is the best way to have a policy engagement rather than writing. Also, there's a lot more work to be done on encouraging transparency of signatories in public policy, especially when we're thinking about talking to companies on how they act in lobbying governments on climate change. We can't ask them to be transparent and consistent when investors aren't doing as much as they can. And a bit more about what we're doing on public policy. We just published last week a paper on the case for investor engagement in public policy, really trying to encourage asset owners and investment managers to be a bit more active in policy discussions. So often I hear from the Commission is, actually, we'd love to have done this legislation, but the company said no, and there was no investors to say yes, so we didn't do it. So there's a lot of money in investments. There's probably a lot of money in this room. So it is part of the responsibility to be up there and setting the scene for regulation. So a bit more about my work plan. So these are the three documents that we're looking at. So the long-term mandates under the investment governance arena, the public policy paper, and the RI quarterly, which I've got another slide on with some nice pictures. There we are. I quite like that one. So we've done 5 RI quarterlies. The idea is that to take a series of academic research, which no one in their right mind would read because it's 40, 50 pages long appendixes, lots of equations and numbers that you really can't work out unless you have a PhD yourself. And so how can we take academic research and really get people acting on it? The thing I always say to academics is you want the CIO of CalPERS to pick this up and react to it in the way that they invest. So the 5 papers, the first one was on loans, second one on fiduciary duty, third on long-termism, fourth on climate. The fifth was a summary of the academic papers we presented at our conference in Montreal. And volume 6 that will come out in the new year is about PRI's role in research. I'd also encourage endowments to join the PRI. We've recently had Harvard, University of California, and Edinburgh University Endowment join the PRI, and we're thinking of building a group of the endowments so they can share conversations and work plans they're doing, specifically on the divestment campaign that a lot of them are being targeted by, and they'd like to know how to respond. So that's what we're trying to create, moving from awareness to impact. And with that, I will finish. Thank you very much.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Helen.
If I go this way, do I not get quizzed?
No, you come here and you're going to stand between the two of us again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation on PRI. It's a fantastic organization. It's been going on for some time.
Yep.
We are signatories as many other people sitting here.
Yep.
We are very happy to be part. But looking at the numbers and looking at the business model that many of us run and seeing the growth going on the, as we call it, emerging markets, the numbers in some of these places are staggering when it comes to the asset owners.
Yep.
5 in Africa, 0 in Middle East, and 5 in Asia.
Yep.
And we all know that asset owners and the mandate we get from the asset owners is very important for us when it comes to integration, engagement, screening. And the numbers that you showed, 26%, on really integrating this into a mandate evaluation is very important. So how will you get more asset owners from this part of the world to participate? It's very important going forward for PRI to get the emerging markets on board.
It's something that I kind of think about most days, I must admit, because the big asset owners out there are the sovereign wealth funds.
Yeah.
And having been on boards with sovereign wealth funds in some of our investments at BT, they would turn up, but actually they weren't engaged and they wouldn't vote. And they thought it was, from a cultural point of view, they didn't want to interfere in the running of the company. But the way that UK governance, and I'm sure most of European governance works, is predicated on having active owners in companies. And so you have this awful standoff and this incompatibility between the sovereign wealth funds and the way that we do business in Europe. So we're talking to the government pension fund in Japan. They will have a conference with them in May. We have the MPS in Korea. And I want to try and do some work in China with CIC, Genco Tree, those kind of the big Chinese investors. I know they won't fill in the transparency. Why would they tell us how big they are when they don't tell anybody else? But I feel it's almost a higher level Secretary General conversation we need to have on how we solve this problem and how we obviously have to move as well. We have to allow them to understand the way of the West and understand our governance, but at the same time, we have to be very aware of their cultural reasons for investing and doing things the way they are. We've seen the massive impact from the GPF in South Africa and the fantastic market they have in South Africa, the CRISA Code and the King Code working together with both sides having responsibilities. And I'd love to take that model to other African as well as other emerging markets. And just quickly on the flip side of that, we're doing some work with various UN agencies on the Sustainable Development Goals, which personally I think are incredibly consistent with the PRI. And actually, if you take to extreme your ESG integration, you probably are looking at sustainable development. So it's a case of bringing those two worlds closer together, trying to think about the investment opportunities that exist in emerging markets and bring them to some of the big investors from the north and facilitating that north-south invest. Now, I'm hoping by answering in a long way, I won't get any more questions.
No, you won't. As the Secretary General, no. Sorry, not this time. We're running short on time.
Okay.
And we'll be back to you when you get on the panel. Sorry about that, my sidekick.
I had a good one.